Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Climate Leaders Live. And we wanted to let you all know that we are recording this conversation. This is Kimberly Larson. You'll only hear my voice. I direct our Communications and Engagement Program at Climate Solutions. I just want to ask you all that we are going to be chatting in questions in the latter part of the program into the Q&A area of the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So if you do have questions, you can put them there instead of in the chat. It's easier for us to just track it. As I noted, we are recording this. We appreciate you taking the time for this conversation in the next hour. And without further ado, I want to hand it over to Greg Small, our Executive Director of Climate Solutions and fabulous leader and convener of this conversation. Thank you so much, everyone, and take it away, Greg.
Awesome. Thank you, Kimberly. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. I've got three people joining me for this conversation who, Mike Brune, I've known for a long time, and is one of the people who I really look up to and I think is one of the best leaders in the climate movement and has been for a really long time. And Don and Alyssa are two people I've started to get to know a lot better in the last year or two and look up to so much. So this is a great conversation. I think the timing's incredibly important, right? We've moved into 2021, a lot has changed. There's a lot of opportunities. And, we just really wanted to have a conversation today about what are the best opportunities for progress in at the tribal level, at the national level, at the state level. And so that's the conversation we're going to have. We hope that we're not going to have a lot of speeches, but we'll have a nice dynamic conversation. I'm going to help lead the conversation, and then, we'll hand it off a little bit later to get some questions from all of you. But to start, I just want to have each of our panelists just introduce themselves briefly, a little about who you are and your organization and how you come to this work. And Don, I'll start with you. Welcome, and please introduce yourself.
Seskopa, good morning. Inni maima machna ticham inakaniku ako haula haula. Inni Pio Pio Mox Mox. My name is Pio Pio Mox Mox, which is Yellowbird. I'm from the Walla Walla tribe. I'm the chief of the Walla Wallas, but I also serve as the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians Climate Change Project Director, which is over 50 tribes in the Pacific Northwest. Been doing that for some time. My Aboriginal homeland is on the confluence of the Yakima, Snake, and Columbia River in Southeast Washington, Northeast Oregon, on the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Pendleton. Former chairman of the tribe, former CEO of the tribe, and glad to be here today. Good to see you all.
Great, thank you, Don. And Alyssa, how about you? You're on mute, Alyssa.
The famous words, right? You're on mute. Atuti Wigwa. My name is Alyssa Macy. I'm a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, Oregon. I grew up on the Warm Springs Indian Reservation and now reside in Coast Salish territories. I'm the CEO of Washington Environmental Council and Washington Conservation Voters. I'm really happy to be here today.
Awesome, thank you, Alyssa. And Mike.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm Mike Brune. I'm the Executive Director of the Sierra Club. We're headquartered out of Oakland, California. You can use he, him, and his pronouns for me. And I live in Alameda, California, which is the occupied territory of the Ohlone people. I've been with the Sierra Club for about a decade, a little more than a decade right now. And I'm really looking forward to the call. Alyssa and Don, it's great to be with both of you. And Greg, really appreciate your leadership as well of Climate Solutions, and really appreciate the policy and intellectual leadership, as well as the organizing work that Climate Solutions has been doing for a really long time. So cool. Looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. Thanks, everybody. Well, let's just get into it. I guess I want to start with, it feels like there's some really big shifts in momentum on climate over the last little bit. I mean, we obviously, the most obvious one is we have a Biden administration instead of the Trump administration, which looks quite different on climate. I feel like every day there's a new major announcement from a major corporation. I mean, perhaps the most high profile, most recent one was General Motors and their commitment to phasing out of making gas cars relatively quickly. And of course, their awesome Will Ferrell commercial that they ran over the Super Bowl. So there, and there's plenty of other signs. And I guess, and I'll open up to anyone who wants to answer this first, is do you feel like this is like a real lasting potential change in momentum? And what do you think are some of the reasons why it does feel like, some really good stuff is starting to happen, and anyone can take it first who feels like they want to go? Don't be shy.
Go ahead, Mike.
All right, Brune, they're calling on you. The people demand a response.
All right, I have been voluntold. All right, well, yeah, well, first of all, I would say definitely there has been a shift in momentum, clearly just at a surface level, right? We're going from, at a national level, the worst president for the environment and almost everything else in our country's history to an administration so far that has the most ambitious set of programs around climate, clean energy, environmental justice, economic recovery, and a bunch of other issues in at least recent memory. So that shift in and of itself is pretty profound. But I guess I would also say that I think that the destructiveness and the divisiveness of the last president masked a shift in momentum that has been years in the making. Really, it was in the last couple years of the Obama administration when we entered into the Paris Climate Agreement and had a great international leadership and diplomacy to lead up to that agreement. We finally got a decision on the Keystone XL pipeline. There was a stronger action at the state and local level supported by the administration. I think that that's when we saw a significant shift that was powered by the landmark study by the IPCC. And then we've been seeing, as you were saying, Greg, we have seen hundreds of companies make really strong commitments all around the world to 100% clean energy or making their supply chains more sustainable and ethical. We've seen hundreds of cities in the US make similar commitments. Obviously, we now have close to a dozen states and many countries who have made commitments to move to 100% clean energy. We're seeing leadership at the school level with universities and colleges across the country. So I feel like momentum has been building for years and years and years, and it was the distractions served up by the last president that helped to kind of suppress or not have that momentum be fully recognized. And then now, clearly, we have all of the ingredients for transformative change, right? We have the public that is on our side, typically in overwhelming numbers, for strong action on climate and clean energy and hopefully equity as well. We have the politics on our side at the state and local and federal level. And clearly we've got the markets on our side. We're now moving away from dirty fuels to clean energy, actually saves money and can help to create millions of good family sustaining jobs. So I do think the momentum has shifted. I do hope that it's enduring. And of course, the next year, couple of years will really tell.
Listen, Don, anything you want to add there?
No, I agree. I was there in Paris in 2015, and it was, for Indigenous people around the world, is very exciting to have 200 different representatives there at the Paris Climate Accord, pressing for environmental justice and Indigenous people's rights, human rights issues around the world, which climate change is. And even after that landmark summit and the commitments made, of course, things dropped off. We're not keeping up to the pace or the requirement of the Paris Accord. And of course, Trump came in and nixed the whole US participation. But as was mentioned, a lot of people pulled together, like the We Are Still In declaration, which started in 17 when Trump withdrew from it. A lot of folks engaged in that: American Sustainable Business Council, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Environmental Defense Fund, National League of Cities, businesses, and tribes. 10 states, 27 mayors, 2,500 leaders from city halls, state houses declared that we're still in, and we're going to do whatever we can on our own to continue this ambitious work that was required. And so, as you can see, from an economic standpoint, the opportunities are really starting to shape up. The new Biden administration is really focused in on climate change as one of its top priorities. From a tribal perspective, it's been one of those top priorities that we pushed with this administration. And we're seeing transitions in communities, native communities. For example, the Navajo Nation, they're moving from coal to clean energy. And they've just implemented a 36,000 home solar, commercial solar project that provides solar electricity for 36,000 homes. They're transitioning from coal to solar energy. And they're transitioning jobs, they're creating jobs in those communities and taking coal workers that had been there for years and making them work in the solar, allowing them to work in the solar industry. So it is happening, and there are some very progressive steps happening right now.
And Alyssa, any thoughts from you on this one?
Yeah, I think all of this, the change in administration and the work that's happening right now is great, but it is decades late. There has been a tremendous amount of work by tribal nations, indigenous peoples fighting to save lands, territories, fighting to save salmon for so long, for decades. There have been people of color in urban areas fighting pollution, advocating for environmental justice. This work has been happening for a very, very long time. So while it's nice that corporations are finally taking notice, I think really we need to recognize the incredible work of people of color and frontline communities that has been happening for so long, that has been under-resourced, sort of ignored in so many ways as not being a priority. What it took for this to be elevated in a real way, in a tangible way that we're seeing right now, is for there to be a global pandemic and for everything to literally stop in its tracks. And I think it was at that point that people started to look around and think, oh my goodness, wow, there's really something happening here. So I don't want to take away from the work that has been done for so long, that has been ignored by politicians, that has been ignored by corporations, that has been ignored by nonprofit communities, and has been basically ignored by philanthropy, that these people, people that look like me, Black and brown bodies, frontlines communities, have been doing this work for a really long time. So I have to say that I'm cautiously optimistic about where we are in this moment in time. I think we need to see what is actually delivered by our elected officials. And I think if we don't make significant progress in this moment, I really see something similar that happened in the last election cycle, where people turn up at the polls and they will elect people that are going to be fierce environmental champions for our communities. So I just wanted to make sure that I elevate that, because I feel like we're starting at, this year or maybe last year, when the fact is that this work has been happening for so long, and it has been ignored. So let's see what kind of progress we can make in 2021.
Well, let's pick up on what you just said, and then I want to talk about, looking forward. But Alyssa, I think you made a really important point, which is, look, we're seeing more and more public commitments from government leaders. We're seeing more and more public commitments from corporations. To me, it feels way more real. Like when I hear the things coming out from most of the major corporations, climate commitments from corporations are not new, right? They've been making different commitments for years. It feels different to me this time. It feels much more like it's coming from the top, that it's not just coming from the marketing side. It also feels more real with a lot of elected officials. But this is to all of you, again, how do we make sure that we do turn what again, to me, feels like real commitments into making sure we can hold elected leaders, corporate leaders accountable to make sure that we make good on the promises? And again, anyone can feel free to start on this one.
Well, I'll speak on in respect to tribal leadership, and I think what we're saying, and with affiliated tribes, we in the Northwest have kind of led the national tribal climate movement, in my opinion. Because tribes in the Pacific Northwest have long been environmental protectors of the land, the water, the air, as Alyssa was saying, whether it be way back in the treaty of fishing court cases back in the 70s and 80s that were critical to protect water and habitat. And so elected leaders, at least from tribal governments, the 574 tribal governments, have always had environmental protection as one of their principles and values that they were elected on. And now there's a big shift looking at not only the impacts from those, but now those multiplier effect of climate change on top of it. And so what we've seen, at least at the national level amongst tribes, 5 years ago, climate change was probably in the top 20 of the priorities that were identified by groups like the National Congress of American Indians. But today, there's a growing trend, and that priority has risen to the top because a lot of it is from the leadership of our elders and our traditional people who live on the land and see the impacts in their day-to-day lives. And it's then been promoted and supported by an emerging group of young leaders, young people, our youth, are really pressing this in tribal councils, in tribal governments. And so we see this huge wave going on across the tribes in the US. And so from the tribal elected officials, that's very important political priority for them today. It's risen to the top 5 for National Congress of American Indians. It's one of the top priorities that we raised with the Biden administration. So we see that trend going on right now. Locally, I'm working in Oregon, and we've seen what happened with legislation for a cap and trade bill in the state where Republicans walked out and basically used their ability to nix the quorum and nix the legislation. And they've been using that tactic. So unfortunately, we haven't made that much progress in Oregon, which is one of the more progressive states. But we've got to hold those officials accountable. And some of the groups that have been working on progressive climate policy in Oregon are saying it's time to focus in on those folks who walked out of the Capitol and didn't do their job. So, that's something that tribes look at as well.
Yeah. Mike, how do you think about this accountability issue?
Well, I think about the accountability issue all the time, first of all. I guess
Sure.
You brought up GM, and maybe that's a great example, both for GM's sake and as a microcosm of what we're dealing with. I'm highly skeptical about GM's announcement, and I'm also highly hopeful of it. Just to look at GM, this is the company that killed the electric car and sat on innovation for many, many decades. This is the same company that fought stronger regulations to protect clean air and clean water and strong climate action throughout the entirety of the Trump presidency and was on the wrong side of a number of issues. Tried to take away California's right and ability to protect the air of its citizens. And right up until the election was an ardent foe of simply trying to help to provide clean air. And then right after Trump was defeated, announced the full-scale commitment to get to 100% electric vehicles. When you read the fine print, has a huge amount of loopholes and squishiness to it. So on the one hand, having one of the largest automakers in the world make a commitment to basically get off the internal combustion engine, you don't want to suppress enthusiasm for that. You don't want to minimize the potentially transformative effects of that. And yet this is a company that hasn't yet earned our trust. Mm-hmm. So we try to hold both. We try to hold a sense of hopefulness, and we want to lock these things into law. We want to make sure that this is a company and an industry that is required to transition to 100% electric vehicles. And simultaneously, we want to keep in mind that simply going from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles doesn't solve a whole host of problems related to the environment and the quality of our lives of people all around the world, and that we need a suite of clean transportation solutions that work for everybody, not just people who can afford expensive vehicles. So I would take that writ large, moving it beyond GM to look at all of the changes that are happening right now, knowing that, as Alyssa said, these are changes that are often coming way too late, that were coming only under pressure or duress or in the face of a pandemic. And many of the solutions yet don't fully address the scale of the problem at the speed that we need, and don't have a set of solutions that address the multiple crises that we're looking to face: the climate crisis, the jobs and inequality crisis, the crisis of racial injustice and gender discrimination. So we want to keep our eyes on the goal and not step on any momentum, but also not be taken advantage of at the same time.
Yeah, I had a quick thought, and then Alyssa, I'll pull you into this. What you were saying, I mean, one of the things, part of climate solutions theory of change is we believe in this sort of virtual cycle of, the more and more that solutions become more economical, the more and the more the business community makes commitments, the easier it is for us as advocates to help pass more and more aggressive public policy. And the better the public policy is, the more that it makes it easier to create markets and so on and so forth for the business community. So I hope, Mike, building off of your thing, when you see more and more businesses, let's just take the electric car example, right? Because General Motors is not the only company that's made a big announcement in this place. Hopefully it makes it easier for us as advocates to pass policies that say, hey, we shouldn't sell combustion engines. We should get to 100% clean vehicles by 2035 or 2030 or whatever it is. So I think it's really important for us as advocates to take those business proclamations, to take the reality of cheaper solutions, ever cheaper solutions, and make sure we lock those in the public policy, whether that be at the state level or the national level, et cetera. So Alyssa, I don't know, any thoughts from you on this sort of accountability issue?
Oh, lots of thoughts. Lots of thoughts. Part of our work in the environmental justice arena, we may be a conservationist, however you want to describe yourself, but we cannot get away from working to ensure that we have voting justice and that people have the ability to participate in a healthy democracy. We have seen nationally a lot of bills coming out all over the country that is an attempt to roll back people's ability to participate in the democratic process, and we need to be watching those very carefully. And we really should be looking at ways to be restorative in this process. People coming out of incarceration should be given the right to vote. They have paid their price to society. Let them be a part of the society. That should be something that's a no-brainer in my mind. And we really need to shift our work around civic engagement to be less cyclical and more long-term movement building. I've spent a lot of time in my career running campaigns. We gear up a couple months out, we show up, we do some work, we're looking at 50% plus one, and then we leave. That is not a way for us to really build a movement. We need to be working with communities to invest money and efforts in these communities to build capacity for people to participate in a healthy democracy. So it's important to elect people to state and federal positions, but the things that touch us on a daily basis are, county commissioners, school boards, things like that. And I think that I've always been troubled with the way that electoral politics has worked, because we show up and we're only there for a little while and then we leave. And I think at the end of the day, we need to teach people and work with people to do the power mapping and to talk about what is important to them. As nonprofit organizations, we come in with our own strategic plans and our own priorities and the things that we want to do. We need to spend a lot more time listening and working with communities to address the issues of concern to them. So that means for us as nonprofit leaders, where do we step back? And I think that's a really, hard thing in the nonprofit community, because we're driven to raise dollars based on the type of things that we want to work on. But I feel like we're in a time where we need to be doing a lot more listening. We need to be working with our foundation partners and our major donors to really start to resource communities that have been limited or completely cut out of accessing resources. And we need to look at what we're trying to do to actually build a long-term movement. So I feel like there's a lot of work that we need to be focused on. In addition to looking at environmental policy, we need to be looking at that piece around making sure that we have a healthy democracy. Those things are connected. And we cannot look at things separately, because you can do all the great policy work that you want, but if you don't have environmental champions that are sitting at the table making those decisions, doing the voting on the pieces of policy that you bring forward, really at the end of the day, your theory of change is just limited. So I really feel like that's a piece that we need to lean in more as an environmental community. Washington Conservation Voters is a part of the Conservation Voters movement, and we're very fortunate to be a part of that larger movement. And that's the same question that I'm asking. And I think a lot of people of color that work for LCV and affiliates across the country are saying, how do we shift this model to really be about long-term movement building versus showing up, doing electoral politics and leaving. So healthy democracy is key to any environmental policy that we want to pass. And I think that we have seen such a tremendous participation by people of color and frontline communities in the electoral process. So we all need to be watching what's happening out there and the attempts to roll back democracy.
Oh my goodness, there's so many threads there that I want to hit on. I'm going to bookmark a few and come back to, and particularly I want to talk a little bit more about movement building a little bit, but I do want to at least frame up a little bit, or have all of you help frame up a little bit. You know, as you look out at opportunity set in the next, I don't know, let's just call it the next couple of years, at the three levels we're talking about, state and tribal and national, you know, what do you think are the best opportunities to really make change? You know, Mike, maybe I'll just start with you because, you know, the Biden administration is such a prominent piece of this. You know, Biden, as you talked about in your opening, his most ambitious set of commitments. He's starting to staff his administration with a lot of our friends and allies who are amazing people. Talked about building back better, 100% clean by 2035, you know, a lot of stuff on federal lands, keeping in the ground. I don't know, Mike, I'm sure you at the Sierra Club talk about all the time, like which are the ones that we really should go after. I wonder if you can share some of those thoughts.
Sure, happy to. Real quick, I guess quickly, I would highlight 6 different things that we are prioritizing. And if I had a little more time, I could probably give another 6 or so, because there's a lot that's out there. This is a opportunity-rich environment to be doing work, obviously, at the national level. So what I would highlight, number 1 is what's being called the Justice 40 commitment coming from the administration. This is a commitment to invest 40% of climate and energy funds from the federal government into environmental justice communities, communities that have been advocating and organizing for decades to have their air and water protected, but have largely, not entirely, but largely been ignored. This commitment was made by the Biden campaign and then carried through from the transition. And it's now a priority of the administration to make sure that potentially massive investments really go to the communities that need it the most, with investments guided and informed by those communities. So that's a historic shift that we want to make sure, I think our community and our country wants to make sure is honored and well implemented. So that would be one. Second thing that I would highlight is it was in an executive order at the end of January, the creation of an interagency task force populated by people at the cabinet level, led by Gina McCarthy and Brian Deese, who's running the National Economic Council, to help coal and gas communities that are being impacted by a transition away from fossil fuels. This similarly is at one level, it's a task force, and task forces really rarely change history. But at another level, this is an issue that is of paramount importance all across the country. We are moving past coal and gas and all fossil fuels. And the way that we do that really is going to impact millions of people and families and communities all across the country. So making sure that in this transition, we have justice at our core and thinking through carefully, how do we make a transition that works for people as well as the planet is going to be important. So helping this administration and Congress succeed at this transition is a second priority of ours. And then 4 other quick things I'll touch on. One is reflected in a question from Mike Tidwell that is moving to 100% clean energy in the electric sector. This was a commitment made by the Biden administration. There's a few different pathways to do it. The fact that we have a president that has said we need to get off of all dirty fuels in the electric sector is profound. It's a huge opportunity that we should seize and succeed on. Similarly, item number 4 that I would highlight is the move to get to 100% electric vehicles by 2030, ideally for light cars or cars and light trucks, and then soon thereafter for medium and heavy duty trucks. We can ban the internal combustion engine and make sure that all our cars are powered with electricity and that all that electricity is clean. That gets to a huge amount of the climate pollution in this country and internationally. And as you cited earlier, there are companies and countries that have already set this goal. And then the last 2 real quick is this administration has set a goal to protect 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. as well as nominating Deb Haaland to be Secretary of the Interior. She was the lead sponsor of that legislation. So just to put that in perspective, we have protected about 12% of our lands and waters in the US over the last 130, 140 years. So the goal is in the next 10 years to more than double that, which is profound and would have a huge impact on the quality of life for millions of Americans, and has an opportunity to reset and reestablish our relationships with tribal nations and heed many of their call for transformative action. So that's a big priority. And then the final thing I'll say, and sorry to take up so much time, is after this $1.9 trillion relief package is passed and signed by the president, there will be another package, a recovery package that is put forward by the administration that will move through Congress that will address the climate crisis, the jobs crisis, and investments needed in the caring economy, sort of across a range of issues. That will be a multi-trillion-dollar package. We put out a report today about this, citing that this will create millions of jobs, good family-sustaining jobs when we make this investment. So that's at the top of our priority list as well, is to make sure that recovery package is robust, it's inclusive, it addresses the interlocking crises we face, and it's passed and signed by the president.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. And as you said, it is a very target-rich environment. Those 6 by themselves are transformative. And again, you could easily list 6, 7 dozens of others at the national level. So Don and Alyssa, whoever wants to go first, please do. How do you think about these opportunities? Don, you work sort of at the tribal level, and you and your organization do a lot of work at the state level in Washington, Oregon. So, how are you guys thinking about this and the opportunities?
Well, we work at the local level with states. We work at the national level with the federal government, and also the international level through Indigenous organizations in the United Nations. But at the federal level, I agree with what Mike has said. Some key actions of this administration and the priorities. We've been involved directly with the tribal priorities that was mentioned. Mike mentioned this task force. And of course, once Deb Haaland gets appointed, she'll be one member of that task force. She's got a strong background and understanding, of course, of tribal issues and climate priorities. We've worked with her directly. We worked directly with the Biden administration, identifying some of these same priorities. We conducted a review of the Congressional Action Plan on the Climate Crisis. In 2019, the House established a select committee on the climate crisis. And one of our representatives from Oregon, Suzanne Bonamici, was on that committee. We also met and worked with the Senate Committee on the Climate Crisis, and they sought input from tribes across the country. We conducted a very extensive review with over 100 tribes and intertribal groups across the country of that Congressional Action Plan. And we've laid out priorities specific to each of those various 12 sectors that are described in that plan. So what Mike is saying is that there will be a number of opportunities coming up. One of those will be the infrastructure package. Congress and the administration have talked about the importance of infrastructure, and we need to be able to look at how we can replace infrastructure with more natural systems, particularly as we deal with climate, but also how we invest in infrastructure for our energy sources. And again, we think as tribes across the country will take advantage of that opportunity to transition to clean energy sources, develop renewable energy sources, including solar. As I mentioned with the Navajo Nation, they're in the process of converting from coal to clean energy. There are other tribes like the Blue Lake Rancheria in Northern California that developed their own off-the-grid system where they actually were able to provide power for their community. And during the wildfires, they were able to have the only government in Northern California that had operations because they were their own energy system that was based on renewable. So we've identified a series of priorities, and we're working with a national task force at the Congress of American Indians that I work on to really press these priorities with the Senate, with the House, and the administration. So we're excited about those opportunities, and many of what Michael has mentioned, we're prepared to take action on. We're organizing a work group across the country of tribes that will start looking at this infrastructure legislation right now. There was a comment in there about one of the questions about some of the work tribes are doing with carbon offsets and forest carbon sequestration. One example, many tribes in the Northwest are doing this, preserving their forest lands, switching from extractive approach to harvesting timber. Places like Warm Springs, where Alyssa's from, and I worked there, put a 22,000 acres of forest land on the east side of Mount Jefferson in a carbon offset program in California. And so that brings resources to a tribe that needed those resources, that have issues with simply drinking water, to invest in those communities while also preserving those forests and helping to offset carbon. So I think that's one approach, but I think nationally the tribes are engaging and preparing. Again, Deb Holland, our leadership at the national level. We have a president of the National Congress of American Indians. Her name's Fawn Sharp. She's the president of the Quinault Indian Nation in Washington. And so we've got some of the most capable leaders at the national level, really representing tribal interests as we go forward. So we're excited about what we can do in this Congress, and we're pleased. I mean, if you can see a stark difference between the Trump administration for 4 years, you would never hear a Native Americans named in any of their press conferences. Now we hear it all the time. And so we're really pleased that we've got a strong relationship with this new administration and people like Deb Holland to help lead that.
Yes, please, let's get across the finish line. Alyssa, you and I, we obviously in our organizations work super closely in Washington. I wonder if you can just a little bit about, what are maybe two questions for you. One do you think are sort of the best opportunities in Washington State on climate and clean energy over the next couple of years? And then, reference, you're part of the National League of Conservation movement and network, and to the degree that you have a sense of, what some of the trends you're seeing in some other states as well on climate and clean energy would be fantastic.
Sure. One of the things that I'm very proud about with Washington Environmental Council and Washington Conservation Voters is that we are a part of the Our Northwest Opportunity Campaign, which is really could be one of the largest salmon recovery efforts in the history of this nation. And this is really looking at 4 principles: communities, making sure that we have a strong regional economy, that we're looking at salmon and making sure that we have an abundant harvestable salmon and steelhead population in the Snake Rivers. Certainly salmon ties into treaty rights, tribes in the Columbia River Basin and the Snake River area, and then also looks at energy. Representative Simpson released a plan that would look at removing some of the dams on the Snake River, which would lower the temperature in the Snake River and hopefully increase salinations. This is a regional effort, but it's something that we're working on here in Washington, and I'm really proud to be a part of that, because as a woman whose people comes from the Columbia River Basin, same with Dawn and the Umatillas, and as Pierce, the Yakama Nation, salmon is not just, it's not just a thing. It is tied to who we are as Indigenous peoples, and it speaks to us and in our core of who we are. So I think sometimes we look at our connection to land in a way that we don't feel it. And I think for Native people, we feel it in a very real way. It speaks to us when we're there. And so this piece of work that we're a part of, I'm really proud to be a part of it. There's a lot of work to do, certainly. And we are excited to be working with both Idaho and Oregon and looking at how we can work together as conservation voter movement affiliates to move this issue. So I encourage folks that are not familiar with this campaign. I don't know how you could not be, because there's a ton of news about Representative Simpson's plan that he has released. So I encourage you to learn about it, but it ties into so many different pieces of our lives, not just as Native people, but into our economy, into orcas, into our recreation. So there's just really such a monumental opportunity with this administration and the elected representation that we have right now to actually do something. We are at a point, at a tipping point, where we may not see salmon in these rivers anymore. And that would totally destroy native cultures in so many ways, and in the economy, all these other pieces. So please learn about that if you're not familiar. I also just want to say here in the state of Washington, you know, there's a lot of organizations, your organization, WEC, TNC, Front and Center, lots of folks working on a couple of things. The HEAL Act is something that has been, is working through the state legislature right now. That would define environmental justice in state law. It would also help to define how we address community needs and environmental justice needs with state agencies. And I want to recognize Front and Center for their incredible work that they've done to push this forward, and the Environmental Justice Task Force that helped to create sort of the foundation in which we're building on. So really encourage folks here in the state of Washington to not only look at that, but to support it. It's really important here in the state of Washington. Clean and just transportation, you know, we need to make sure that we have a transportation system that is funded, that's holistic, and focuses on accessibility. Right now, you know, transportation sector represents over half of our climate and air pollution in the state of Washington. And we really need to encourage people to use public transportation, but it needs to be reliable and accessible. So we need to work towards that. Also working on a clean fuel standard that has passed out of the House. It's now going to the Senate. This is the third year that this has been done. So let's hope that we can finally cross the line here in the state of Washington. We have waited long enough. We have put a ton of work into this. We have environmental champions at the state, in our state legislature, and they need to do their job. The other piece that I would add, conservation works, part of the Environmental Priorities Coalition work that we are a part of. Lots of the large environmental organizations are a part of this coalition, but we want to make sure that as we work through our budget process, that we are not balancing the budgets on the back of environmental programs. We have made progress in the state of Washington. We need to make sure that we are funding these programs so that we can address environmental issues in our communities. And so we need to just make sure that we're not balancing the budget on environmental programs who really take up such a small percentage of the overall state budget. I would also add that part of our work in just moving issues is just, again, listening to those most impacted. I really appreciated what came out of the Environmental Justice Task Force report, which was just talking about overburdened communities. They changed the terminology and it really just resonates to me. Impacted communities, the communities that are overburdened with environmental justice impacts. And I think that's just a really great way to be talking about this work. So I'm really proud to be working with folks like yourself, Climate Solutions, but I'm also really proud of the partnership that we've established with Washington Alliance for Black Lives Matter, and working with Front and Center and through other coalitions that are led by people of color. Again, we need to be following their lead and following the lead of women. So thank you for recognizing Fawn Sharp's incredible leadership. It is Women's History Month. And so there's a lot of women out there that are doing phenomenal work that we need to be honoring, not just in March, but all the time.
Awesome. Thank you, Alyssa. Oh my goodness, I've gotten so reared up. All right, let's talk about movement building. I mean, we have certainly talked a little bit about that, obviously, throughout this conversation, but let's talk about it explicitly. I know for me, you know, so I'm looking at being in the environmental movement now professionally for about 30 years now. And I got my start as an organizer. So I've been thinking about movement building and organizing and power for, you know, my entire professional career. You know, I guess from my perspective, I feel there's been more changes in movement in the last 5 years than there were in the 25 years combined in my experience before that. There's just been a sea change in the way that the climate movement is constructed and how we are working. I guess, you know, just broadly speaking, I wonder how all of you think about sort of the state of the climate and the climate justice movement these days, and how you feel, you know, it's shifted over time, and where we still need to go to get to the place where we need to be the power that is necessary to get to speed and scale. And again, open it up to anyone who wants to go first with that sort of broad question about how you think we're doing as a movement on climate and climate justice.
Greg, I'll add a couple thoughts about it.
Great.
You know, Alyssa was kind of referring to this earlier. We've been doing this since the 1850s. This is not just the last 25 years. You know, the treaties that our governments, our tribal nations secured with the US were environmental protection laws. When you talk about salmon, protecting salmon, when you talk about protecting the elk and the deer, the foods, the roots, the berries, the land, the water, all of those were what we fought for over 7 generations ago. So when people talk about the environmental movement and all these folks that have been involved, we understand that, we support it, and we love it. And we're happy that we're finally being joined by fellow Americans in this battle that we've been doing almost exclusively for 865 years and even longer on the East Coast. So it's very welcome support, and we're very pleased to see a whole generation of people being educated about the environmental movement and where it came from. So we're pleased about it. Tribes across the country, I think, are coming together, particularly on climate. And this has been a very unifying voice. It used to be just a handful of tribes in certain areas. And now there's 574 tribal nations coming together, not only just in the US, but working with First Nations in Canada. So we think that's very important. The other part is the youth movement. We are encouraging our youth, and on April 1st, we're having an Indigenous Youth Empowerment Summit that we're hosting. We invite people to hear some of our youth. You know, we asked our youth about, well, should we invite Greta Thunberg? And they said, no, we have our own Indigenous youth that are doing the same things in our communities. And they've been doing it. Standing Rock was just a new thing. We've been doing it for a long time. And now we've got this network of young people that are coming up and moving this effort going forward. People ask us about, is this part of the Indigenous movement? And it is. It's a continuation that we've been working on for hundreds of years, and now we're really gaining momentum. So I just want to share that perspective with you.
Thank you, Don. Alyssa, Michael, your thoughts?
Thank you, Don, for that knowledge. You used some terms about treaty rights that I haven't heard, so thank you. I feel like you sort of dropped a knowledge bomb on us. I would say that, you know, building ultimately is about relationships, and we really need to spend time getting to know the people that we're working with. It is challenging in a time of COVID and quarantine. We're doing everything by Zoom. But when things start to open up, I think we need to do some in-person stuff, get to know people, because if you want to create change, and part of that is, again, listening, and you need to know who you're working with. I think that's really, really important to the environmental movement and to the environmental justice movement, is just spending the time to get to know one another. It's important to understand people's politics, and it's also important to have a strong relationship. So when you find yourself in a time when you have conflict, that you have the ability to work through that. And I think part of our jobs as folks working in the environmental movement is we need to take our own responsibility to, one, be able to work through conflict. We also need to do the work that I think we talk a lot about DEI work, and that's sort of the buzzword, and we're throwing lots of money at it. We're trying to DEI our organizations. At the end of the day, that work will never stick unless we're willing to do the work that we need to do to heal, to be able to sit in conflict, to be able to sit in the uncomfortable moments when we have disagreements, the ability to work through healthy conflict. And I do this all the time with the folks that I work with. Like we all need therapy, but we all need to just do the work outside of our 9-to-5 job. That this is a journey. Oh, there's a question, Beth, diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So in order for that to really stick, you have to do your own personal work to help make that stick. It is a lifelong journey. It is a lifelong journey for folks to who tribes are, what treaty rights are, how to work with tribes, and to invest the time to make those relationships. So I would start with do your own work, invest your work. It is not a 9-to-5. This is a lifelong journey. We also need to make sure that we're developing strong relationships, and we're really looking at partnerships, especially for historically white-led organizations like the Washington Environmental Council, Washington Conservation Voters. We need to really be looking at how we're partnering with organizations in real ways. I don't need to show up and say I got all this stuff. Part of that stuff should be money. because we are, there are a lot of organizations out there on frontline communities are not resourced like historically white-led organizations. So it's a shift in the way that we do work. It is scary. It is scary as a nonprofit leader for myself to start making that shift. But I think that this is the way that we need to go if we are going to remain relevant in this day and age. So the other part of that, movement building, we need to listen to frontline communities. We need to respect and honor Black leadership, Native leadership, Latinx leadership, Asian leadership, working with the LGBT community. That is bringing together all the voices of those that are overburdened with the impacts of environmental injustices. And we really need to start making a shift in a way that's real. So I feel like that is incredibly hard work. Here I am in this position and trying to move a 55-year-old institution to do something different. So I feel like it's like this different sort of uncharted territory that they're working through. And I feel really honored to be here in the state of Washington and to work with the folks here to be able to do that work and to try some new things, to also make mistakes and hopefully to correct those and go forward in a good way. So for those folks that have the ability to move resources, foundations, major donors, we really need to make investments in frontline communities in very real ways because they are the most close to the impacts of what we're talking about. And we should not be raising up issues without doing that concurrent work to make sure that we're resourcing them in ways to actually address them as they see fit, not as we see fit, as they see fit. So I'm excited to be a part of these organizations and to be in this moment in time. And like I said, I'm cautiously optimistic about the new administration. I am more optimistic and have more faith in the people that are doing the work on the ground every single day. Those are the people that give me the most hope. And of course, as Don mentioned, young people, fierce. If it wasn't for you, I also don't think that we would be making some of the progress we're making right now. So thank you, young people, for holding us adults accountable, even sometimes when it's uncomfortable. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Mike, follow that up.
Well, look, 100% on what was just shared by both Alyssa and Don. You know, I'm sitting here, I haven't been on a panel with Alyssa or Don before. We're just really just meeting each other. Our little squares are interacting for the first time. And I'm filled with gratitude. You know, first for Kimberly, you and Greg for creating this platform for us to talk, and Climate Solutions for bringing us together. And, you know, even more so for Don and Alyssa for your leadership and what you just shared. You know, Don, I really appreciate the reminder, the reminder in a very generous spirit in which you said, you know, we've been doing this work since 1850. We've been around here for a long time. And, you know, I'm reflecting that, yes, of course, the environmental movement didn't really start with Rachel Carson or any other early leaders. And the generous way in which you're saying, welcome, took you a while, but welcome. Thanks for coming. And Alyssa, you know, I really appreciate your citation of the work that we need to do individually or institutionally to build the relationships and deepen the relationships that we need to have to do this work effectively is right on from my perspective. And as a leader, your reflection of how some of this work can be scary to sit in conflict sometimes, or to talk about shifting resources, that can be difficult as an organization who has its own budget. You know, so what I would add on to that, there's not much that I would add on to that beyond an expression of appreciation, and to say for a group like the Sierra Club that is large and national in scope and also local, in addition to what Alyssa was saying about doing our own work as individuals, as leaders, as management teams, and across the organization, a spirit of, you know, genuine humility and curiosity is required. We are trying to establish relationships at the local level on an individual basis or across organizations and movements. And we have a lot to learn. We have a lot to offer, and we have a lot to learn in those relationships. And so trying to speak a lot less and to learn a lot more, I think, is going to be some of the glue that helps to keep our movement together through conflict and through difference, and ultimately will make us a lot stronger in the end. So I really appreciate the conversation and what's been shared so far throughout.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. Well, we're getting near the end of our time, and I just want to provide an opportunity for the three amazing speakers we've had. If you have any sort of closing thoughts, we've got about 100 people or so on the call here today. Any thoughts that you want to leave folks here about, what to focus on, or, anything you want to share to sort of close out what I thought was just a really fantastic, fun conversation. Maybe I'll go to you, Don, first, and then Alyssa, and then Mike.
Thank you, Greg. This earth has been around for a long time, and us human beings, the Natitite, have been here just for a short time. And we've been able to screw things up over what we call 3 previous worlds. We're now in the 4th world. And every time we stray away from the law we call Tamanwit. Tamanwitla, the law gave us this law to live by. And our native people, indigenous people, try to follow that law because that creates the balance. We have an understanding of respect and reciprocity with the earth and all those things. So that's a very important value when we talk about keeping our political leaders accountable and ourselves accountable. That's what we follow, and that's important as we go forward. So we have to think of the 7th generations that follow us. And just like our leaders 165 years ago, when they negotiated the treaties with the United States, they were protecting us. They were thinking of us. And that's an important thing for us. If you love your children and grandchildren, you will do something for them because they're the ones who inherit what we leave behind. The last thing is salmon, and as Alyssa was saying, I put in the chat box our efforts now to be able to transform our energy system, and people that rely on that say, oh, this is carbon free, hydro, but it's killing salmon and they're near extinction. Now we have an opportunity to transition from hydro that's killed salmon for the last 50 years to maybe clean energy sources in the Northwest. So we're looking for partners to join us in that efforts, and tribes are stepping up to help Simpson, and we're looking for other members of Congress to help that effort. So we thank you for your time, for listening, and appreciate all of my friends who are on this panel. Look forward to working more with you, Mike. We appreciate you, and Alyssa. We've been working together, and so we're happy to share our thoughts and look forward to all you out there to join us.
Awesome, thank you, Don. We appreciate you, Alyssa.
Sure. I've spent a lot of time in my head in the last year. I'm sure many of you have. COVID to me has been the great pause, a moment in our lifetime where we have slowed down in ways that we've never done before. It's been an opportunity to, I think, reevaluate our relationship with one another, our relationship with stuff, and our relationship with Mother Nature. The Great Reckoning, the death of George Floyd, has, I think, brought a national attention to something that has been occurring for centuries, the oppression that has happened in this country. And I think it's finally something that has elevated beyond Black and Brown communities as a priority. And I really hope that that doesn't get lost in the work that we're doing. It is so key to address. We need to address it. And we cannot keep sort of turning our face from it and facing it head on. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I'm really hoping that the environmental community steps into that space with courage and with dedication. We are in a time right now that I have been calling the Great Healing. We are really looking internally, many of us at a personal level, about how we live our lives, our relationship with the outside, and I think reevaluating how we choose to exist in this world. And that's work that we need to do, because part of the damage that we're doing to the environment is around capitalism and how we choose to live our lives and the things that we think that we actually need. And we need to really reevaluate that and think about what brings you happiness. I think my life is so much more simple than it's ever been. And that feels really good. And I think that that's part of my personal healing around just existing in a way that is more in line with my cultural teachings, but more in line with just saving this planet for future generations. As Don said, we have a tremendous responsibility right now in this time. We need to act boldly and swiftly and without fear to address the climate crisis that we're facing. So we need to hold our elected leaders accountable, and we need to do a lot more listening, especially in the environmental community, with overburdened communities and frontline communities. We need to listen. So I really hope that this time that we're in gives us the courage to do that. And when we're not doing that, the community needs to hold us accountable as environmental nonprofit leadership. So I'm really thankful to be here with all of you and to do this work in this moment in time. And thank you, Greg, for the invitation to be on this panel.
Awesome. Thank you, Alyssa. So grateful to be working with you so closely. Mike.
Yeah, look, again, appreciations for the panel. I grew up on the New Jersey shore on a barrier island, and the Bard of New Jersey used to talk all the time about, he had this saying, nobody wins unless everybody wins. Nobody wins unless everybody wins. I think that we learned the lesson in the pandemic about how interrelated and interconnected that we are, and nobody can really be safe unless we're all safe. And the same is true with regards to climate action. There will be pressure this year at the state level, at the regional, at the local and national level for us to start to compromise on our values. Do we really need the clean energy jobs to be high road, high wage, family sustaining jobs? People will ask us. And in fact, we do. Do we really need to make sure that policy puts equity at its core and actually delivers on the promise of addressing racial injustice? Yes, we do. But there will be pressure that will pull us apart. Does the recovery package actually have to have investments in infrastructure and climate action and in the caring economy? Many people will say no, and they will try to pull us apart. And it could create a Hunger Games scenario where allies are actually fighting with each other and competing with each other and pulling each other down rather than lifting each other up. So I do think that this decade could shape to be the most consequential decade in human history because our actions on climate change will reverberate for centuries. I think we have an opportunity to address multiple crises at a systemic level if we continue to work together, to support each other, to learn from each other, and to listen to each other. And I'll say that the last hour has given me more hope than any panel that I've done in a really long time that we actually will achieve those goals. So again, thanks for bringing us all together.
My goodness, thank you. Yeah, I as I said when we started, I was incredibly excited about this panel, and it's been all that and more. Thanks all of you. Our next one, just to give people a heads up, will be in April. This part of our Climate Leaders Live. The dates to be determined will be in April. It's going to focus specifically on equitable transportation electrification. We're going to have Fred Krupp, the CEO of Environmental Defense Fund, Leslie Aguayo with the Greenlining Institute in California, and then Climate Solutions, V. Pykar, to talk about transportation electrification work in Oregon. Alyssa, Don, Mike, oh my goodness, gratitude to all of you. I got a ton out of it. And thanks for all of you who joined, and I hope you got a lot out of it as well. Talk to you soon.